and a very warm welcome to everyone who listens in to this webinar. I'm really excited that we're now having a panel on portrayal of women and gender roles in films and how it reflects society. And what we will be discussing today for the next hour and a half is how women are portrayed in Arab films, how this is reflecting the societal context of the films, but we will also talk about how films and other cultural expressions also reflects back on society and are part of and contribute to societal change. In other words, how films can contribute to reinforcing either negatively or hopefully positively the image of women. There will be an exchange of thoughts, of reflections and experiences with our fantastic panel. And the aim of this discussion is to contribute to sharing different realities lived and how they are differently lived and experienced by women and men, and how this is reflected in films. I hope we will get a better knowledge and insight in the trends in Arab films, and also that this will be a bridge building between people and cultures. As Roxana said, my name is Charlotta Sparre. I'm the director of the Swedish Dialogue Institute for the Middle East and North Africa, which is a platform for contacts and dialogue between Sweden and the rest of Europe and the Middle East and North Africa region, working on issues related to political, economic, and social change, as well as on increasing mutual understanding in the areas of culture and religion. And I am incredibly proud to have with me today an absolutely amazing, wonderful panel of prominent women working in film in the Arab world. They all have incredibly impressive backgrounds and experiences. They come from different countries and different parts of the film industry. We have with us Mai Masri, Palestinian filmmaker, director, and producer. Perihan Abou Zeid, Egyptian serial entrepreneur in the film industry. Linda Mutawi, Jordanian Palestinian film producer living in Sweden. And Viola Shafik, Egyptian German filmmaker, film curator, and film scholar. And I will come back and introduce them more properly later. But before we start this session, let me just say a couple of words on the structure. In a couple of minutes, we will, as the starting point, watch the trailer of Mai Masri's amazing film 3000 Nights that was screened at Malmö Arab Film Festival a couple of years ago. And Mai and I will then have a conversation about her films and how she portrays women. After this conversation, we will watch the trailer of Mariam Touzani's film Adam, that was the opening film of Malmö Arab Film Festival last year. And we will then move into the panel discussion with Perihan, Linda, and Viola. And for those who participate in the meeting on Zoom, please feel free to post questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will try to address as many of them as possible towards the end of the panel discussion. And for those of you who watch this on Facebook, please just sit back and enjoy. So let's get started and let's see the trailer of 3000 Nights. So there it is.
לאחר שבית המשפט הרשיע את הנאשמת בסיוע לפיגוע טרור.
خليك معنا تصديني في شعر لازم ندعي لك. طلعوني يا جماعة.
Thank you. That was a small little teaser of an incredible film that I rewatched the other night. Mai Masri is a Palestinian filmmaker, director, and producer living in Lebanon. She has made documentaries, but also this feature movie, and with a focus on real life struggles of women and children living in the occupied Palestinian territories in Lebanon. May has received a lot of international awards for her films and is hailed as a pioneer in the Middle Eastern film industry. Together with her late husband, filmmaker Jean Jamon, she also founded Noor Productions. So, May, let me first ask you to tell us maybe a little bit about 3000 Nights. Why did you decide to focus on women prisoners? Where did you get the inspiration? And how did you depict the women characters in the film?
Thank you, Charlotta, for this introduction. 3000 Nights is based on a true story of a Palestinian school teacher who gives birth to her son inside an Israeli prison and struggles to raise him behind bars and to survive and maintain hope. I was inspired to make this film by a woman I met many years ago when I was shooting in my hometown, Nablus, during the first Intifada. And I was very touched by her story because she told me how she had given birth in chains, you know, and how she raised her child with the other women. And this story stayed in my mind for years, and I felt it had to be told. Why women prisoners? Because this is, again, a story that hasn't been told. There hadn't, when I made the film, there hadn't been many films on Palestinian prisoners, and especially not on women prisoners. Women, I think, are not, when you think about Palestinian prisons, you don't normally think about women, although there have been hundreds and thousands of women who passed in these prisons. So I felt it was important to focus on these stories and also to show the experience of children who were born behind bars, because this is also a story that has never been told in the Palestinian context. So yeah, I mean, these are what motivated me to make this film.
Maybe you can tell us, for those of us who haven't, or those who haven't seen the film, if you can maybe tell a little bit more about how you depict the different characters in the film.
That's right. I tried to show like a variety of women characters, but they're all based on real women. Because my whole, I did research before I shot the film, and I did many interviews with women prisoners, and I wanted the film to be based on these real stories and real characters. So there's a variety and there's multi-layered characters. The main character, Layal, who's the mother, is just an ordinary woman who's imprisoned for something she didn't do. And in this experience that she has, she slowly becomes a stronger person, and also after she gives birth to her son, and with the other women characters, or the other women prisoners, it makes her, you see her arc as a woman develop in the film. And this is a person that anyone can relate to. She's an ordinary woman. The other characters, you have the young teenage sisters who are also in prison, a grandmother, a kind of tough militant also, because there were like tough political prisoners as well. And you have the woman who's a bit hesitant and ends up collaborating. And I wanted to show that those different layers and not show them always strong or always weak, you know. Same thing on the other Israeli side, because they're also Israeli characters. There's the kind of cruel warden, but there's also the human rights Israeli lawyer. There's a contrast between the actual Israeli prisoners themselves. So I wanted to show like different kinds of experiences that you don't normally see on screens, because in mainstream films, women are not usually, don't have leading roles. And when they do, it's not always women that really kind of resemble us.
I know, I must say, I really love this extremely broad spectra of the characters in the film. But as you say, how you also show the weaknesses and the strength, as well as the infighting between them, as well as the solidarity that is being built up. So maybe it would be interesting, I think, if you could reflect a little bit on why it is important to tell the stories of women, and how a film like this one or some of your other films, how they help in raising awareness on the role of women in society.
Yeah, I think it's important to focus again on women's stories. I mean, I'm interested in also, I mean, the society at large, children, women, but I think women in particular, there are other layers too. For me, it's fascinating to look at those layers, the social layers, and to make a film that can raise awareness within the society, because I believe that if you want to change your society, you have to change it from within, and with real experiences that people can be inspired by. So the role models, I mean, it's important to show positive, I think, role models, and not just women who are victims. And the women I'm interested in are like self-made women, and not, they didn't achieve what they did because there was like a male support behind them. They're self-made through their efforts and struggle. They get empowered, and I really think it's important to focus on the human dimension and the resilience that women have, the strength, the kind of sense of solidarity. So these are images that we need, I think, in our society to bring about positive change. And I think films, because they're larger than life, also for this people, any kind of person watching a film, they see their own reality with new eyes, because it's on the screen in film, even though it might be around them, but they don't see it. But I think when you show it to them in a kind of interesting and creative and positive light, it really can have a positive effect.
And if 3,000 Nights had been placed instead in a male ward, what do you think would have been the main difference?
Well, first of all, I mean, the mother, you wouldn't have the birth of a child inside the prison in the male ward. And to me, that's a very important and interesting kind of dimension, because it allowed me to work on imagination, the kind of relationship with raising a child, and the solidarity, you know, those are beautiful, poetic elements. But of course, the whole prison experience is fascinating in itself, especially in the Palestinian context, because it kind of symbolizes the situation of living under occupation. You know, the prison is a metaphor for that.
I mentioned already that you have received a lot of awards, including for this film, but I would be interested in hearing what reactions you have heard when you have screened the film, and if there have been any difference in the reactions that you have received in the Arab world and internationally.
I think the nicest reactions is the kind of younger women who've you know, felt that this film resonates with them, that it touched them. Also the prisoners themselves. To me, it's important to have that kind of connection with my local audience, to feel that it's true, that I'm being true to the story. With internationally, it's I've had a lot of good feedback, and sometimes the discussions have been very, I think, interesting. Sometimes some people might have moved them to be disturbed. Maybe I think it's good because you need to wake people up.
Yes.
You need to show them something, move them. I think that's the power of cinema. It's to touch people, move them, to get them to reflect, and maybe even take some kind of action. This is my kind of hope that cinema can achieve.
No, absolutely. I think that all of us who are sitting here would totally agree on that. And I think for me, it's the beauty of cinema and many other cultural expressions, but maybe cinema more than many others, is this ability of connecting both with our, so to say, with our intellect, with our heart, and with our guts at the same time, and show a reality that we have an opportunity to enter for a brief moment, and that yet stays with us. So you are one of the many women filmmakers that we have seen and now, so say, becoming more and more of a name. I've been impressed to see one after the other, and notice that we now see more Arab women filmmakers percentage-wise than we see in Hollywood or in Europe. Could you maybe share some of your reflections of why do you think that is the case?
First of all, isn't that amazing?
It is amazing.
It's surprising and amazing. Not surprising to me, but maybe to some people, wow, because there's an image of the Arab woman of being a victim and being, but we have so many women artists, and film in particular now. I mean, at least 50% of the films being made in Palestine, Lebanon, Tunisia, and some of the Arab countries, there are more and more women. And in Hollywood, I mean, 2 years ago, it was only 4%. Now they're working hard to raise the number of women, in Hollywood to 10% now, but that's still very, very few. In Europe, it's like 20, 25%. And I'm actually surprised at that. I think maybe one of the reasons, first of all, we have a lot of stories to tell, a lot of passion. I think that's the driving force. And plus, we're making independent films, and we don't have an industry. I think that makes it hard for everyone, whether they're women or men. So we kind of have almost, I don't know if we can say equal chance, but there's less of a business and money involved, because that's when women are usually pushed aside. So I would say that's when a main reason that we don't have an established industry that kind of, pushes women aside. It's just, it's a struggle. So I don't know. Those are my. But now, I mean, with time, there's more. When I started, I was maybe the first, one of the first women directors, especially in this part of the world, in Palestine. Now there's so many amazing women filmmakers making really quality films, and that's something to be proud of.
Thank you very, very much, May. I know that you have some other parallel commitments and maybe coming and going a little bit, but we are really grateful that you could be with us and give us a first few thoughts. I think not least on this last point, it's something that I'm sure that Perihan and others would like to come back to also later. For those of you who want to hear more of Mai Masri, I can also warmly recommend that you listen to a beautiful podcast, Conversations at Fikra, and for those of you who participate in the meeting, I'm posting the link in the chat for you now. So thank you very, very much, Mai. And before turning over to the rest of our panel, we will see a short little clip with the trailer of the film Adam by Mariam Touzani. Thank you again, Mai.
تسجلش لها. واش مع ولاد دوزي اللي عندنا قدام داري؟ لا شويه غنمشي نلقى فين نبات. غنخلي الدوزي عندي يومين ولا 3 ايام على ما ترجع لكم، ولا تقلبي على هذاك اللي حملك. شي داكشي اللي كيصحاب. ما بغيت نعرف ولا لا عليك لا على حياتك. بتونس بيك وانت معايا، بتونس بيك وبلاقي فوق وش عليا هادشي دابا. عارفاش هي قلتي لي ماما كازيزه على ورده، ولكن ما بقاش كتسمعها ملي بابا مات. انت في الصباح سيري بحالك. انت يا وحش ما عندكش القلب. سمعت بواحد المرة كتاخد الدراري الصغار وكتلقى الله يربيهم. هادي اللي ما غتكونش. خليه يتولد بلا سمية ولا حرام. إلا بقى معايا حياته غتضيع. لا تتوهمني ما نعرف شنو كنكون.
So in both the trailer of these two amazing films that we have seen, we've seen the challenges that women sometimes are facing in terms of conflicts or socioeconomic hardships or patriarchal structure. But we also see very clearly women who are not passive victims. They may be victims of these challenging circumstances and caught in realities that are tough, but they are clearly there building their own struggles and their own realities. At the same time, we also know that there are lots of stereotypes and lots of prejudices, and these exist in Sweden, in the West, as well as in the Arab region itself. So what does this mean and how can this be addressed? And to discuss this, we have a fantastic panel with Dr. Viola Shafik, Egyptian-German freelance filmmaker, film curator, film scholar, who currently holds a position of researcher at the art history department at Ludwig Maximilian University. And she is currently researching aspects of the history of Arab documentary. Viola has also authored a number of books on Arab cinema, and she has directed several documentaries. We also have with us Linda Mutawi, Palestinian, Jordanian, British film producer with truly multicultural background and who has worked a bit all over and currently lives in Sweden. She has also worked on various types of projects ranging from Hollywood features to current affairs documentary, and is currently involved in various international projects as producer and co-producer. Linda is also the co-founder of Fikra, a Stockholm-based company with a mission to develop, facilitate, and implement creative projects between Scandinavia and the Middle East. And last but not least, we have Perihan Abou Zeid, who is Egyptian serial entrepreneur in the film industry. Peri is currently the head of marketing at the for the Middle East at the video streaming provider View. And prior to this, she co-founded Movie Pigs, Arab Cinema Week, and Kabira Media Productions. And she has previously also led the Cine Guna platform, the industry arm of El Guna Film Festival. So as you can hear, it is just an incredible panel that we have. And I would like first to ask a quick question to all of you. What brought you into film, Viola? You are muted,
Well,
Heather. Thanks.
it was rather, it was interest. It has nothing to do with my gender. As a quick answer.
Linda?
Thank you, Charlotta. Well, actually, I've always loved film since I was as a young kid, and we had a huge library of films at home. But when I was finishing school, actually, I initially wanted to go into drama. I wanted to be an actress, and my father, being, you know, the good Arab father that he is, was like, you know, why would you want to do that? There's no work. You will never find work being an actress. I mean, this is in the late 90s, so at least in Jordan there wasn't that much going on in terms of film and drama. Since he was a media person and a journalist, he said, well, why don't you study something that's slightly broader, like media and communications, and then you can, you know, get to learn about different sides of the media industry, and then you choose. If you still want to do drama, you can do it for your master's degree. I think it was good advice. I think he was hoping that I would follow in his footsteps of becoming a media person. But I remember in my first semester in my university in London, I took one of my courses was film as an art form. And in the first class, it was like one of those light bulb moments. And I thought, yes, this is it. This is what I want to do. And I didn't look back after that. I've always just been focused on being in film. It's what I've always loved.
How wonderful it is when you find your calling. Perihan.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotta, and I'm so honored to be amongst everybody on this panel. It's such an honor. For me, actually, it was sheer coincidence. You know, it started with the Arab Spring, and my friends were actually filmmakers and producers and screenwriters, and they worked together on a project that they wanted to turn into a company. So they brought me on board because I know business. And I just fell in love with it. And, you know, fast forward a few years later, I was in the US doing my MBA, and a movie came out, American Sniper, represented Arabs in the worst kind of ways. And it's just made me so angry. And I just, you know, the entrepreneurial person in me decided that, you know, I'm going to do something about it. And that's how I also started a platform that will showcase Arabs and the Arab culture through film, because to me it was the most powerful and truest form of art that can actually tell our true story. So it was a coincidence that just changed my life, and I would consider myself lucky to have found my calling as well.
Wonderful. So then I would like to open up with another question to all three of you, or maybe a combined question. Why is it important to tell the story of women and include the perspectives of women? Or maybe I should actually ask the question even more broadly and say, is it important to tell the story of women and include their perspectives? And if so, why? And I think maybe we start with that part, and then I want to go into also how the image of women affects society and vice versa. But maybe we can start with the first part of the question. And did we take the same order again with Viola? And you don't need to be as brief this time.
Okay, because you advised us to be very brief. I thought, okay. All right. No, well, I mean, here we come up with an easy or maybe evident answer, because we often imagine women to be marginal, even though in terms of numbers, they should not be considered a minority. But well, in some sense, they are treated as a minority in certain, well, in certain times of history and in certain, also social circumstances. So this is why we always think it's evident. Yeah, of course, we need to tell the story of someone who is considered underprivileged or marginalized. There is a sort of responsibility to do that. But actually, I have to point out that if we look at some of the data and some of what has been, researched, is that many women filmmakers actually do not consider themselves neither minoritarian nor are they really interested to be, nor are they particularly interested in female topics. They think, most of them, they do not want to be considered or to pushed into that kind of corner of feminism and of women's stories. They don't think, that because they are women, they are more, apt or more likely to tell female stories. Because here comes again, actually with this comes a sort of new box in which, the industry or society tries to push also women filmmakers. This is just in brackets. And I don't know, would that be considered a brief enough question or a long enough question answer?
That is absolutely wonderful, and we will just build on this as a conversation as it goes along. And maybe I actually would like to turn to Perihan with the same reflections, and maybe also reflecting on how you define a women-led or women-focused project. And is it the cast, filmmakers, or the story, or
thank you, Charlotta. I always ask myself that question and ask everybody that question because just like Viola said, it's not an easy choice, or in many cases the preferred choice, to actually be cornered in that space of feminism and just focus on women-led stories. When you're making films. But to me, I actually think of a women film or a woman-based film as something that shows the power of women and the story of women in all aspects of that artwork. So whether you're a director, whether you're the producer or the writer, or the hero of the story as an actor or part of the cast, that still gives strong visibility to women. And that is what we actually need to do. That is to answer your question, why do we need actually women's stories? Why do we need women films? Because women are obviously, stating the obvious, are a huge part of society, and marginalized or not, depending on where you are, they need to be seen. They need to be normalized as part of the landscape of everything. And film as a reflection of what society is should actually showcase that. So I'm on the business side of the industry. Can you say that I'm not in the film industry? If I work on a project, can you say that this project did not have a woman? No. Same thing, for writers. There are amazing women writers that you don't always see, but they're the ones that actually create the beautiful stories that we see, whether those stories are about women or not. And the ultimate, obviously, form of that or version of a women-led project is the one that talks about the story of a woman, obviously, because that sort of puts it on the public platform, shows a segment of society, tells their story, because otherwise, not only that maybe other people won't tell it or men won't tell it, but sometimes they just don't know it. I've faced that. I lived abroad a lot, but then when I came back to the region, I realized that there's a perspective that men are just not exposed to. And who's a better one to tell that story or share that perspective than another woman? So I salute everybody on this panel and every other woman who has been part of the filmmaking industry and made those stories, whether you're in front of the camera or behind the camera, because that's how we actually make that difference.
Thank you very much, Perry. Very interesting thoughts. And Linda, what is your take on this?
Well, I mean, I agree with a lot of what was said already. I think, you know, definitions can be tricky in this sense, because it's like trying to define where a film is from, the nationality of a film. In this day and age, it's become almost impossible to do that, because we are, you know, women are not only a major part of society, we are half of society. So of course we need to be represented. And I think, you know, whether it's women or men, we should be able to tell the stories that we want to tell, regardless of whether it's about a feminist issue or not. You know, as Perihan said, you know, films and cinema, as any cultural expression, is a representation of society and that moment in time when the film is made. And, you know, we are a part of this society, and we are a part of the changes that are happening, and our stories are a part of the fabric of everyday life. So of course they should be, you know, represented on the screen. And I think why it's important, other than the fact that we're the better sex, in my opinion, but I think it's important because you know, we have been, as Viola has said, you know, largely marginalized for a very long time, or at least in terms of cinema, it's been very much dominated by men. The narrative has always been written by men, even historically, even in society, even in journalism. So we need to own our own narratives. We need to write our own stories. We need to write stuff that's authentic, and not wait for the man to make a film about women from, you know, his perspective. We need to do that for our, you know, for our own sakes.
Thank you very much, Linda. And I think before we go into the image of women and society and so on, I think it would be interesting to actually do a little bit of a looking back and the changes over time. And Viola, with your background, looking at Arab cinema over a longer period of time, how do you see that the representation of women have been changing in Arab films over time, and how do these changes reflect the changes in society?
We have first of all to make it very clear that we are talking here about more than almost now 120 years of so-called representation, but actually also of local production. True that the first films that were made by Europeans, but it's very clear that already during in the 1920s, the first women filmmakers did make their appearance in the Arab world, and we very often forget that. And of course, Mai put it very beautifully, is that she was one of the first to start making films in Lebanon and Palestine, which is absolutely true. However, and we have also to make clear that actually the 70s, late 60s and 70s, that's the onstart and beginning of a wave of women filmmakers all over the world, internationally. We have to make it very clear and to underline that also in the West, there is a very long period of several decades, then the beginning of cinema and the invention of the media, where women were almost not represented as filmmakers. There were very, very few. Well, there is a very interesting phenomena with regards to Egyptian cinema, which we all hopefully know by now was, you know, the hotbed of the first Arab film industry, starting in the 30s, but it began actually in the mid and late 20s. And there were several women actually who worked there. Some of them were artists, but there were also all-round artists like Bahiga Hafiz, for instance, who worked as producers, writers, actresses, designers, and so on, and who directed several films. interestingly, the moment when in the mid-30s the industry started to consolidate itself, and the big studios, and we can see that then at that time the phase and the period of the big studios in Egypt started, only one or two producers remained, like Asya Derer, but the directors did not work any longer. So this is what Mai already pointed out, that the industry, wherever there is money, had tended at the time to marginalize women as directors. And this is not only the case in the Arab world, or was not only there the case, but everywhere. And the reasons are numerous. One of them is very funny because, I mean, I heard once a woman saying, well, you know, I have to look for my kids. I cannot go socializing in the evenings when the men do their, you know, the business talks. True enough. Yeah. This is one of the points. Anyway, so now to resume just very briefly the historical trajectory is that in the 60s, 70s, we have a revival, or let's say a new wave of women filmmakers who started to be very present in film, and increased in numbers, and in all Arab countries, or at least the main Arab countries who were producing films at the time, or started, you know, to get a foot into the door. Okay, and many of these women, actually, it's not only Mai. For example, if we talk about Lebanon, there was also Jocelyn Saab, for example, Hani Srou. These were very militant women who worked particularly also in documentary, and were very, very courageous, working, you know, as reporters, as war reporters, like Jocelyn Saab, for example, but also, you know, other filmmakers, and bit by bit they also started to make fiction films. All right, so this is just to make clear that there is no difference actually between the West and the so-called global South with regards to this issue. There is only an issue, of course, with other countries, like whatever, you know, West African countries, or very, very poor countries, where there is a difficulty for men and women to make films.
Super interesting, and it would be interesting if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on this comparison between the international film scene and the Arab film scene, and what was it that was the enabling forces that actually made women step forward, and what is it that then at times maybe have led to the more marginalized roles?
Well, I guess one of the issues in the late 60s and 70s was actually that there was a revolutionary leftist culture all over the world, and so it did not only, you know, work as a catalyst for women filmmakers, but of course also for a lot of avant-gardist male filmmakers. So it worked for both sexes, actually. This culture was trying, you know, it was interested because this was the era of decolonization and also of, you know, the Cold War. So there was a strong interest in what is marginal, but also, you know, in a kind of revolutionary film culture, in a national film culture. This applies to, and in the West, there was a huge, not only solidarity movement, but also there we have the new wave, cinema verité, and all these kind of new and interesting film movements, which tried to kind of create a new film culture, and the Arab world was not detached from it. You know, on the contrary, there were strong, you know, there was a strong interaction on the level of festivals, etc. And this, of course, worked as you know, made it possible. Also, we have to see that in the era of decolonization, also many of these countries worked, you know, to improve the education, you know, for both men and women, to allow free education. And this also allowed women to come to, to enter the academic field, in the cultural field, but also, in other. So we have a lot of journalists who appeared at the time, and also, in all fields actually, so that we see the same picture in many Arab countries, like in the West today, that in most fields women are sometimes even more numerous in some like in pharmacology and and journalism and so on. We have more women enrolled than men. So this is again a general international movement that helped, so women entered, and also some of the countries like Egypt, they had their own film school. So naturally women also did have an education. It was difficult at times, because particularly Egyptian cinema was linked in a way also a bit had a bad reputation because, of the representation. And here we come now to what sort of representation cinema allows or does not allow. And again, here we need, this is another talk, but so some women, of course, report that they had difficulties actually to enter the field, but notwithstanding, they arrived at that point and they were able to make their way. Where is she? Yeah, my beloved Al-Sama the Trace, Najia bin Mabrouk, for example. She had a very long way, to go from the south of Tunisia to, get and study in Belgium and become one of very important women filmmakers in the 70s, 80s.
And out of curiosity, because you mentioned the Arab films obviously not being detached from what is happening in the rest of the world and the contacts that have been there for a long time, but I would imagine that it was more going in one direction than in the other direction if we go back in time. I mean, having international films being well known for Egyptian film producers, for example, but not necessarily the other way around. Or is that a wrong assumption from my side? When did the shift in that case come, with a greater interest for the mutual or more reciprocal exchanges between Arab film and Western film, for a lack of a better word?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see, that, for example, there were Arab films screened, like the musical Wedat, for example. It was screened and also some films by Yusuf Shaheen in the 1950s, and Wedat was made in the 1930s. They were screened at the Venice Film Days, and there was no problem, of representation. Of course, they had not the same numbers, but still, we sometimes forget about these kind of exchanges. However, in general, we can say that to be represented in festivals was always was not so exceptional. One of the first films that received in Cannes, one of the first Arab film festivals to receive films to receive a prize or an award at Cannes was an Algerian one in the 1970s. The issue is to have films actually be distributed commercially. This is a completely different story. So on the art house level and festival level, there is already a long history of exchange. Okay, it intensified, let's say, as I said, during the decolonization process. It intensified for a second time in the 90s, because the European, not only art institutions, but also the European television channels who already were there to rescue on the production level European cinema. They actually also started to support Arab films, and some of these films, like for example Farid Bouridir's Halfawin, made its way to European screens. I mean, through the help, or with the help also of television. All right. So in the 90s this started, but now actually during the last 10 years we have, I think, reached a new level, because it has become more common to have films from all Arab countries actually to be able to access the screen. These are not the very big screens, but at least, you know, it's very common that you have at least a few films being distributed in art house cinemas all over Europe, and also in the US, I guess, coming from the Arab countries. But again, here, I mean, we still need to ask questions about how many, you know, I mean, we know, you know, some films, like Elia Suleiman's film, I remember in Germany, one of his films, he just, okay, it ended up in an art house, you know, but in the end, if you look at the numbers, he had just 1,000 viewers, because this is what art house cinemas. And now here comes my second question: if films have such a little number of viewers, what sort of effect do they really have on society? You know, here, and this is I think I would like to open up here this for.
Yes, no, and let us, I think that is a very interesting question that I think we all have reason to come back to, and maybe I would like to turn to Perihan. I've seen you sitting nodding here. You've also been, working on the industry side, on the distribution side, and these are issues that I know that you think a lot about. So it would be interesting to hear first your reflections on what Viola has said, and then I have a couple of other questions for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Charlotta, I was nodding because I actually understand what Viola was talking about in terms of challenges, but also because I speak the language of numbers. That's what I do in this industry. And while the numbers, if you look at them from, you know, the sort of the bigger picture perspective, they look a bit gloomy, but then when you dig deeper and do some analysis, you realize that it's not necessarily the case. So one beautiful statistic fact that I would like to share is that if you look at the top 10 Arab films, or top 5 Arab films that in terms of international box office, the majority of those are actually made by women. Nadine Labaki comes on top of that, actually, with 3 of her films. Specifically, I'd like to mention the case of Kafr Naoum. For instance, it had a budget of $4 million and it made $69 million in international box office. By way of comparison, so that's 4 times, I mean, that's a huge return of investment, but by way of comparison, when you put those numbers against Parasite, which is the Korean title that won the Oscars, that got celebrated everywhere, Parasite had 4 times the budget of Kafr Naoum, but only made 3.7 times the box office, which, in percentage, the ROI is higher for a Lebanese film that didn't win the Oscars, that didn't have major international representation like Parasite, that wasn't celebrated everywhere, but it's also a story about motherhood and about tough childhood, and it's a social story that, just similar to Parasite, anybody anywhere in the world can relate to. So that to me is an exciting thing to look at. Generally, I would agree with Viola. Distribution is actually the most important thing. I mean, Parasite wouldn't have qualified for the Oscars if they didn't have a distributor that gave it the theatrical release in the US, that qualified it for that competition and gave it that kind of visibility, that jacked up their box office. This is one thing that we don't really, and I know that we might end up talking about this, what can be done, but this is one thing that's that we lack in the region. We don't get enough distribution, especially international distribution for Arab films at large, let alone Arab films that are considered art house films, like Viola said, or festival films, and that is something that's extremely important because great films are great films, no matter what they are. And as much, and one thing that Hollywood discovered actually is that as much as the mainstream works, everybody diverse from the mainstream in one way or another. So if you are a Marvel fan, you're also gonna have something that you relate to that's on the art house level or art house scale. And it's about the producers and the distributors that realize how people actually divert from the mainstream, what are the stories that they like to see, and they pick those stories and give them the visibility because their ROI is going to be probably higher than any other investment that they will make.
And what are the main blockers for, so say, a better distribution?
I think part of it is actually the way that, especially if we're talking about women's stories, the way that media and marketing is done for them. It's always about the struggle of the Arab woman or the struggle of Arabs. Or, I wrote once an article about how Arabs in foreign films are always represented as belly dancers, billionaires, or bombers. And that's pretty much the only representation if it's told by the West. And it's when Arabs make those films, we're expected to talk about also the struggle somehow. While in fact that's not true. I mean, like you can talk about anything and everything, and you can talk about women that are empowered, you can talk about women that are just living, all those sort of societal things. So I think one part has to do with how actually films that talk about women's stories or films that are made by women are actually portrayed. I mean, I'm pretty sure every single female director from the region is always asked, what are the struggles that you face as a female director? When in fact, we probably don't see that as asked as much in the US, even though we have better stats in women participation in the industry. But because that's always sort of the notion or the narrative that's projected about women in general and also women in the industry. One thing, another statistic that I would like actually to share. So like I said, I'm in the business of numbers and I work in marketing for an OTT player. So we often look at, evaluate the content that we have and how people, consume it and everything. And one thing that we realized is that even though only 1/3 of any content that we license, because, that what's available in the market, even domestically, has women at the center of it, and by that, but that's based on my definition. So whether it's a women cast, women-led cast, women's story, or women director, or women writer, only 30% of those, but they actually outperform significantly titles that don't have women. So when you look at our originals, those that we actually have more control over, more than 60% of those actually have women representation, and they're sort of our claim to fame. They're the ones that are actually making us successful. So I think we just need to tell the story a little bit differently. And I would ask, media critics and even panels like these, where we not only talk about the challenge, but also we represent the data, we represent the information that makes all those decision makers, the ones with the ultimate power of deciding what ends up getting to the platform where the user sees it, make the decisions that are right for them. I think one of the gaps that we have is that there's, not all the people on the industry side, on the filmmaking side, speak the same language of the people that are after the money. And it's all about communication, and on the, bigger platforms where we can say, oh, okay, you know what, maybe you think this is a very mushy story about a woman or a mother, blah, 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 but let me show you the data that tells you that this story will bring you more money than any other story. And that will change the conversation completely, and hopefully will help, shift the needle a little bit when it comes to distribution and even funding.
Thank you, Perihan. And before moving over to Linda, I have one more question. The streaming services that we are now seeing and the fact that there is so much more that is accessible. I mean, I can just look at myself. I would have to go almost to, I mean, I love going to Malmö Arab Film Festival, but it was one of the few chances going back 11 years ago when the festival started to have a chance to see Arab films. First of all, much more is available in the cinemas, but then all the streaming services. I mean, the availability at Netflix, for example, of a lot of both series and films and of different kinds. How does that affect also the possibility for all these brilliant women in the film industry to be more seen and represented and heard, and the stories about women to be told?
So I would say that OTT streaming platform or players in general, they offer two very unique things. I mean, there are so many good things for the user, but for the industry specifically, there are two things that are significantly different in the structure or the business model that avail more opportunities for filmmakers and producers. One is that you're no longer relying on a finite potential for revenues. By that I mean, if you're looking at films, theatrical distribution, you're always calculating, you're doing your math based on the potential box office, and that is finite. You know what the maximum that you could possibly get. If you're talking about TV series, you're also looking at advertising money that's going to be placed, you know, against your show. But for OTT, the sky's the limit, because really, if you make a good title, you attract more people, you attract more subscribers, and there's no limit on how many subscribers you can get. And the better the content that you offer, and the higher the subscribers you are able to acquire, the higher the budgets you can actually invest in producing those kind of content, films or that kind of content. So that's one thing that actually helps a lot actually with offering opportunities for OTT. The other thing for players, and also the fact that you have to fill not a TV grid, so one thing that's playing at the same time, or a box off or a theater where only one film is playing at the time. No, you have to have an abundance of content. So an OTT player will not exist unless you have a lot of content that satisfies a lot of people. So again, there's always hunger from platforms like us to actually acquire good stories and acquire more content, and that's more opportunities for filmmakers. The other thing as well that makes OTT different is the availability of data to understand the user behavior better. That is not the same case with anything. You know, there are some on TV, there are some on movie theaters, but nothing compared to digital platforms that help us understand the nitty-gritty details about the user's behavior and their, you know, their appetite, what they're looking for, and how they consume it. And that helps OTT players decide on the production of content based on the user's behavior and appetite, which often results in picking better stories. So you're no longer picking a film because of the star, of the A-lister. No, A-listers almost become irrelevant. Not 100%, obviously, they're still relevant, but they almost become irrelevant because it is the story that's going to bring the user and keep them engaged in the platform, which is one of the most important KPIs for any OTT player. So that also avails a lot of opportunities for writers, for actors, young ones that are up and coming, because again, it's all merit based. And one last example I'm going to tell you, we have a story, we have a series, a TV series that we just released a couple of months ago in end of January. This one is actually based on a novel written by a Saudi novelist. I think it was her first novel ever. And it was adapted to a screenplay by an Egyptian screenwriter, Mariam Naoum. And it's co-starring, the two co-stars, one of them is a woman who's very young. She's not an A-lister, she's just a 25 rising star. And the show was a huge success. So that is an example of how OTT can actually avail opportunities for different people across the industry, just because they're different from the mainstream kind of format of or traditional format of offering content.
Thank you very much. We'll see if we have it. There's Linda is back. And Linda, I would like to turn to you. You have now been working for quite a number of years, both in international productions, Swedish productions, Arab productions. And it would be interesting if you could reflect a little bit about what are the differences and similarities in these worlds, and how much do they resemble to one another?
Thanks, Charlotta. Yes, I have been lucky in that sense. I mean, I can say that there are definitely many shared challenges, you know, sexism, elitism, racism, these things exist in the film industry in all regions of the world, including Sweden. I think from a female perspective, there are definitely common challenges. I mean, breaking into the industry, which has traditionally been much more male dominated, and telling our own stories and breaking away from subjects like we were saying in the beginning, like sometimes some female filmmakers want to break away from subjects and perspectives that are only reserved for women. And I think that is a shared challenge that we have both in the Middle East and in Sweden and Europe generally. I think breaking into the industry as well, you know, being given the opportunities, being taken seriously, especially in terms of having positions of leadership, still has some challenges. I mean, of course, it depends a little bit where you are and what kind of projects you're working with and all that. But I mean, I think it's quite a complex issue, but there are definitely a lot of similarities there. I would say that from my perspective, you know, the Arab world, we are still quite culturally, we're still quite conservative, and we're still steeped in a lot of tradition. So it's hard if you're starting out for a woman to choose to work in the cultural sphere and sort of, you know, without some form of stigma or some kind of resistance to that line of work. But I think also something that we were talking about, especially previously with Mai, that, you know, we have such an amazing, diverse group of female directors in the Arab world right now. And, you know, female directors are almost as much represented as male directors. And I think, I mean, there are many things that Viola touched on as well, but I think there's also a social aspect to that. And that is, you know, Arab women are fighters, I think. Like when you live your life constantly having to prove yourself and your worth and struggling, you know, for your rights all the time, you're a fighter by nature. So if this is something that, you know, you want to pursue, then, you know, nothing I mean, this is, of course, I'm generalizing, but nothing can stop you in pursuing that dream if you want to choose that. But I mean, working in the film industry in general, whatever gender you are, is difficult, and it does, you know, require so much commitment and sacrifice from a person. So you kind of have to be really passionate about it in order to pursue it. But I think, for example, in Sweden, I mean, Sweden as a society, you know, prides itself on being very egalitarian and quite politically correct. And, you know, everything is about equality between the sexes. And so in a sense, like the struggles are maybe different, I would say, from a Swedish perspective. And from an institutional level, from a cultural or from a social and political level, I would say there's much more support here to, you know, push female voices forwards. And, you know, of course, we know through the Swedish Film Institute, I mean, there's a mandate to have, you know, women very much equally represented to men. And to have minorities represented and to have like the diverse voices. And I think that after Me Too, like post Me Too, not only in Sweden, but in the Western world in general and the world at large, there has been, you know, even more of a push to for female voices and female stories. But you know, from a Swedish perspective, I mean, I have mixed feelings about it a little bit. I think it's great that there's such a push for female voices and for minority voices. But sometimes it feels to me like it becomes a box ticking exercise. You know, if you're female, if you're LGBT, if you're, you know, non-white and all these things, that you suddenly, you know, you get more points in that sense, without, you know, I don't want to sound cynical or negative, but I feel sometimes it kind of becomes so political that it takes away from the artistic merits of a project. And I think in terms of, you know, from my own perspective, working in Sweden now, I feel that this is a challenge, at least one that I've faced. And also something that Perihan was saying, which I agree with as well, that, you know, like because we rely, like Arab filmmakers rely so much on support from Europe and from the Western world. And there is a kind of cultural block in terms of doing or telling stories that are not about victimization, that are not about tragedy and trauma and all this, that it becomes, you know, like, again, it becomes a box ticking exercise. And in a way, it's kind of, maybe it's a bit naive. I think people don't really see it in that way, but it is, in a sense, it is an Orientalist view in a way on, like, these are the stories that we're interested to see, because these are the realities that we think exist in your part of the world. And that's simply not true. So that's, you know, that's been my perspective on working in different cultural settings.
I think that is an extremely, extremely important view, and realizing that we're talking here about, so to say, multi-layered biases, stereotypes, prejudices, and that all of them somehow need to be unpacketed at different layers. And of course, that goes from between all different societal and cultural contexts, but it's something really important. So now I would like to turn to you again with a question to all of you on how you see that the images of women in film that we have been seeing over the years, but maybe not least in contemporary films, how are they affecting the society's view of women? And do you see that the films, with the greater variety I think that we are seeing, but are we still seeing films that both contribute to, so to say, cementing old, more traditional images of women, and seeing films that rather contribute to the changing images? And are they equally many, or are we seeing more of progressive films and films that are contributing to a positive change? Viola, can I start with you?
Now, here I am. Well, complex question, because again, we are talking about a century, not just about a few years. And we are talking, of course, also about different kinds of cinemas. I mean, if we speak about documentaries, or if we speak about mainstream films, we will receive a different answer than if we speak about art house films. And here again, are we talking about the more innovative experimental type, or are we talking about, you know, the more the moderate art house type? So every time, and also in every period of time, we will receive a different answer, actually. Also, I mean, there's this funny this word reflecting is so, it reminds me so much of the word mirror. You know, even in Arabic, they used to, you know, until the 70s, 80s, you would hear a lot, yeah, cinema is mirroring society. As if, you know, when we are looking at the screen, this was a mirror of reality or of something, even in terms of mainstream cinema. Of course, it's much more complex. This is a cultural representation. These are discourses that are formed, and etc. And of course, the way how mainstream cinema represents women, it has changed. Feminist discourses have entered mainstream cinema all over the world, also in the Arab world, for sure. And issues, even, you know, in the 30s already, and in the late 20s, issues that have been interesting to society, for example, Arab society at the time, the issue of arranged marriage. This was an issue in films. It was an issue in melodramas and so on. The form was mainstream, but the topics, virginity, name it, you know, today it's, there are different other issues. It was always kind of present also, the way how female participation in society work. And of course, we know of the more feminist types of films that were produced in the framework of mainstream cinema. And here, not every stereotyping is bad, actually. You know, not every, I mean, very often we speak about stereotypes as if all of them were harmful. Actually, sometimes in parodies also use stereotypes, but they kind of are, you know, they still, they take you out of your comfort zone, and they try, you know, to deconstruct issues. So in that sense, cinema can, of course, it can you know, kind of make you think, or it can give you you know, or it can disturb you, but of course it can also confirm and be things that you're thinking, and be affirmative. On the other hand, we know from reception theory that there is something like selective viewing. You know, people, if they don't like the way how things are spectators may, you know, just decide to leave the film if it's not you know, something that they like, or you know, they will look for issues that confirm their view. And we know from changes of behavior that there are two important issues. One of them is that you create models, you know, I mean, models that you want to follow, and this stars did serve as these kind of models for a very long time. But sometimes this can be also a negative model in a way. So you can also you can decide to resist this model and you know, choose a different one. So selectivity comes here in again. And women have all the time been kind of subject to this to these kind of roles, you know, and of personas that were created on screen. Yeah, did I? Yeah, I don't know if I. Yeah, it's such a huge topic. We could go on.
It is a lot. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. But let us move over to Perihan and then to Linda on the same reflection. How do you see this issue?
Very short answer. I honestly, I'm conflicted about this because, you know, on one part, I totally agree with Viola. You know, women stories and issues have become, you know, the center of many of the works that we've seen over the past years. I mean, in my lifetime. But at the same time, I'm always very afraid of the subliminal messages that you see in mainstream works as well, and many of those, I would say, were only a form of regression, not progression. So there is a mix of both. I guess the beauty of the world that we live in right now is that, you know, growth in the market is happening through the younger audience that's exposed, that's digital native, the one that will not shy away from actually speaking up if they don't see anything, if they see something they don't like, and I think that kind of user level scrutiny, as opposed to what it used to be before media, will force filmmakers to pay closer attention to what kind of stories they're creating, what kind of messaging they're doing, and what kind of artistic value they're bringing to the culture and the market and the society that we're in.
Can I just add one issue, Charlotte?
Absolutely.
Charlotta, yeah, there is also this idea of negotiation. So I like to look at popular cinema, for example. If you look just at because art house cinema is so often, and innovative cinema is really so often caught in that, in a very small circle of and access of audiences, for example. I mean, there are films that might be very revolutionary, but if no one sees them, then there is no effect. But popular cinema actually has worked also. I mean, despite of our negative view of, a lot of what has been, and sometimes it is very negative, really, it is negative what this type of cinema does spread. But at the same time, also looking more, at the subtext, a big part of the cinema is also engaged in negotiation, which means, you have kind of more conservative and more and affirmative aspects, and more let's say revolutionary or mobilizing, and at times you will find them actually struggling within the same text.
Yes.
And these are works that are very interesting, and it happens a lot. And people actually can pick out what they want. And mainstream cinema was also used to be very, very much interested in in this temporary kind of destabilizing order temporarily. Particularly comedy is organized that way, which means there is a temporary relief of oppression. And also, if you look at some of the mainstream type films, you will find also that they offer you also something in this respect. Of course, the Marxist view was always, they are, it's the opium of the people and be careful. But at the same time, I rather like to look at it as a negotiation, and looking at each film really very, very, very kind of carefully, and to see where the effect is. But I agree generally.
Thank you, Viola. I want to turn over to Linda with this question, and then we have a couple of more questions and only a few minutes left. But over to you, Linda.
I mean, I would say what I have to add to what was already said is I think the role of women in society has changed, and I think cinema really reflects that. So Viola was talking earlier about the emergence of more female filmmakers in like the 60s and the 70s, and I think it's not a coincidence, first of all, because before that women were subjugated into a specific role within society, and if you wanted to break away from that, then you really had to be you had to be an anarchist almost, to move away from that role that was given to you. But then, of course, with the women liberation movements, and which of course affected the Middle East, it was not only in the Western world, and still going on till now. Then female voices were able to enter the sphere, the cultural sphere, more and have more opportunity. Now, it hasn't been great opportunity, but it's improving slightly. I think, I mean, it's a very complex issue about how much it can influence society, as we've already, touched upon. Distribution, I think, is a very big problem, because if you can make the greatest, most revolutionary film in the world, but if no one sees it, then what have you done? What have you contributed towards change? So in the end, I think it's distribution, and there's an institutionalized discrimination that we need to work against, because even now, when we have VOD platforms and everything, there's still you know, you still have the same challenges. They're just wrapped up in a different package. So, you know, if you're a film or a series from the Middle East, whether it's a female story or not, it's very hard to get these like prime spots. You know, that you might get put on Netflix, but unless they advertise you, then you know you become like some obscure film that you will only find if you're really digging and if you're really looking. And I think also the other thing that I wanted to say is, you know, relating to society's expectation on women. So with women's liberation and us being much more present in, you know, not in the workforce and in the cultural sphere, but also the expectations of women have risen a lot. So not only, you know, we are the mothers and the wives and the caretakers, but, you know, we're supposed to be the career women, and we're supposed to, you know, fulfill certain social expectations. And I think that is something that is getting reflected in modern films, but that needs, I think, I mean, not only in films, this is a social problem, I think, that needs to be discussed and needs to be unpicked more. But I think cinema is a very powerful way to bring up these discussions. And I think this is true of women in all cultures.
Thank you very much, Linda. We only have 3 minutes left, but we have a very interesting question here from Nasser Mutawi on what are examples of recent films that this panel could consider hopeful or even as triumphs in the portrayal of women's stories. It would be interesting to understand which films and women filmmakers show hope in our times and why. So really a minute each in trying to highlight a film and why you present it. Viola, would you like to start?
I mentioned already, actually, shall I tell you something? A film that I really love is Bahiga Hafez's film, Laila the Bedouin, because this is just an art piece, you know, from the 30s. She was her own director. She was the main actress. She designed her costumes. They were beautiful. And she was a composer, actually. She composed her own music. And of course, it's a very, it's a melodrama about, with a national subtext of, an Arab Bedouin woman who gets, hijacked and by the Persian. By the Persian king, which is, a metaphor, of course, also for, at the time it was considered also a metaphor, or we could consider it as a metaphor of colonialism. So anyways, I think this is this is one of the most beautiful films of, Arab film history for me.
Thank you. Perihan.
That's a tough one to answer, but I already mentioned Kafir Naum. I think it was a great success on so many levels. I think even from a story perspective, it's not showing the typical story of a woman as a hero. In fact, it's showing the flaws of a mother and then giving the perspective of why it's tough for her to be a good mother in such bad conditions. So, and the fact that it was made by a woman, and the fact that it made a great success, that film definitely moved me, and one of my favorites for sure.
Thank you, Perihan. Linda.
Yeah, it is a tough one to answer. I would have to agree with Perihan as well. I mean, Nadine Lebaki in general has done such a tremendous job in terms of, women stories. And they're, I mean, I would say they're hopeful. I mean, even Caramel and Where Do We Go From Here were, in my eyes, were hopeful. And it's again, it's a question of definition of what is hopeful. But I think there's a new generation of female filmmakers in the Middle East that are really making some very interesting choices. There's a bunch coming out from Tunisia. There's, you know, the new wave of young Egyptian filmmakers. Of course, you know, Palestinian filmmakers like Anne-Marie and Najwa and Najwa Najjar. I mean, they all have their female characters are very strong. I mean, of course, the stories take place within hardship, but you know, the females are badasses in a way. So it's not showing sort of or cementing traditional stereotypes, I would say, of women. So there are lots of examples, I would say.
Wow, what a fantastic ending of this discussion. We have been talking about so many different things. I have learned a great deal from all of you. I think it's been an amazing discussion on the importance of so to say, telling the stories of women, but also how much is happening and how much is changing. And you have been giving so many insights and examples from the experiences that that you have. I must say I am so much longing myself for the time when we can go back again and sit in a cinema and watch the movies. In the meanwhile, I'm very glad that we also have access, including during the Malmö Arab Film Festivals, to the films of the festival, but also in other opportunities of sitting home in our sofas and watching a great deal of good Arabic films. Thank you for your suggestions and tips also here at the very end. So a million thanks to all of you. Thank you, Viola. Thank you, Perihan. Thank you, Linda. And thanks to Mai Masri, who has left us a bit earlier. But it has been absolutely wonderful to have you with us. And thanks
Hopefully
also
next
to
time
Roxana.
we meet in person as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlotta.
Thank you, Charlotta.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks,
Bye.
Roxana, and the whole MAF team for all your work.
No, we are the ones who should thank you for this amazing, amazing webinar. It was an absolute joy to listen to. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Have a
Bye,
lovely
everyone.
day.
Bye.
Have a
You
great
too.
day.
Bye.
Bye.